So we're going to really be working from this page in your handout, which should be the back side of the memo. And then also I passed around a sheet that I did this evening that says facts, general fund facts.
Fun fact.
Fun fact, they're not fun, I guess. Well, it depends on your
This is the general fund facts, and it's on the back of the memo is this page.
Yeah.
The packet that has the memo on it. This is page 2 of the packet.
Yeah, keep that.
Maybe
I'm sorry, I got hung up over here. Mr. Quinn.
I got mine.
And we'll add to this. I know a couple of weeks ago, several of you had asked for some information, like what does a mill generate in terms of revenue? So this is the beginning of that as it relates to the general fund, and we'll continue to expand on that in the utility fund. So we've spent our budget, primarily our budget discussions up to this point, talking about the capital infrastructure side and the dedicated revenues that we have there. We've really worked over the last several years to segregate the operating lives in the general fund. So our service delivery and police and public works and parks and recreation and administration, community development, code enforcement, all of those general government functions live in the general fund, and have really tried to move away from using that for our infrastructure investments. So what we know, and so I want to just talk about, I also passed around this sheet, which is a summary of our mill levies and utility fees, was in your very first budget information packet, but I'm sure most of you don't have that readily available. So I wanted to just redo that this evening. It just gives you that quick look as to kind of what has happened in terms of our mill levy, stormwater utility fees, solid waste utility fees, and transportation utility fees from 2002 through the 2013, actually 2014 budget.
Okay, do we have that sheet here?
It should have been in group passed around, so there's maybe a file.
It's passed. It's over there, yeah. Steve's got one.
What's that?
Stop
with Steve. Stop with Steve. Is it underneath?
What's that? I'd like to
Oh, wait a minute.
Thank you, Pat.
Wow. Okay. They're right here.
So I'm going to kind of end up bouncing around probably among several of these sheets tonight, because really what we want to do, and the budget that we gave you is by no means our recommended budget or a proposed budget. This is where we wanted to start, because as we talked about things, reduction in fine and fee revenue, reduction in some of our parks and recreation revenues, some of those other things. What we wanted to show you is that as we start the work of the budget, there's a lot of work to be done, because we have a lot of competing goals that are outlined in the budget resolution that is adopted every year. That was included in your packet. And in order to get those, or to think about what those budget policies need to be for the 2015 budget, we didn't want to start tinkering within the departments, either on the revenue or expense side. So this isn't a staff recommendation. We will be bringing forward staff recommendations that will be based on the feedback and the guidance that we hear from you, and recommendations as we work through with Jerry as a budget team. So, but we felt it was important to show you that you've got a lot of competing priorities, and when you start to have big swings and fluctuations in your revenue streams, I think Amy said it several weeks ago, we can have philosophical changes in service delivery, but they have real budgetary impacts, because we've grown over time into those revenue streams. And so if you look at one of these 11 by 17 handouts, the one that says changes in fund balances of governmental funds over the last 10 years, we'll come back to this, but as a highlight, this is taken from the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report in the statistical section. So we accepted that last month, or earlier this month at the council meeting. But that line that I've highlighted is fines and fees. So that translates, and if you look from 2004 to 2013, you see some really significant fluctuations. And if you look particularly at 2009, which was the high point in terms of the citations that were issued as a city, and you look at where we are In the last 5 years, it's a 19, well, it's actually a 19% decrease just in revenues from 2012 to 2013. We're talking about really significant, and it happens to be right now happening in this revenue line item. It could just as easily be happening on sales tax, on property tax, on franchise fees, on a number of things. And so we really have to collectively, as an organization, say, you know, to bring our budget into balance, we need to consider and discuss enhancements to revenues. We need to look at reductions in expenditures. We need to look at changes in service delivery. Because we know when the revenue is shrinking, we can't continue to do even sometimes all the things that we could.
Refresh my memory. What is the use of money in property?
Investment income.
So could
Interest.
potentially one year we had more opportunity for investment than the
Our interest rates were a lot higher. So if we go back, I tried to match up the other things that I included in your packet, just as kind of background information, because I think as we go through the general fund, it's important for you to think about the goals and objectives of each operating department. So those are included in your attachment A, and the staffing and the people that it takes to deliver those services. At 6.7%, I think we were sitting, or $6.7 million in a $10 million budget. That's the largest share, and the lion's share. It's always been that way. It takes people to provide the services that we provide. And one thing I've included on your general fund fact sheet is that if you look at the last 5 years, and this would be, I could go back more than 5 years, but the number of full-time equivalents or full-time employees in the general fund has averaged 71. So we've not really had much fluctuation, maybe a position or two over the last 5 years. In the 2014 budget, we are at 71 full FTEs, full-time equivalents. We don't always talk about here and use that language the same way that they do in, for example, the federal government or some other larger organizations. We tend to be, because of our size and because of the things that we take on, we're very flexible in terms of evaluating needs when we have position vacancies. So although the total number hasn't changed, we've rearranged people and responsibilities to help us accomplish the goals and objectives that we have. But we've done that with essentially, at least for the last 5 years, people. That number doesn't include part-time or seasonal hours budgeted at the community center or the outdoor pool. If I take the total number of hours and divide that by a full-time person or full-time hours, it's about 27. But that's not an efficient way to run our community center or our outdoor pool. So we continue to kind of look at those in terms of hours. So I don't know, I think maybe if we start back on this budget sheet, I'll just kind of very quickly run through some of the revenue highlights, challenges and opportunities, and then some things on the expense side. Again, with tonight's goal really being to have whatever conversation you are comfortable having as we begin to move forward and really get into bringing this budget into balance when we come back to you later in June. On the property tax side, if you look at this other 11 by 17 sheet, when we think about property tax revenues here in the city of Mission, Kansas, and then also your cheat sheet here is interesting. So if you go to the left-hand side, this third yellow column that says total assessed valuation.
All right.
If you look at what has happened to the total assessed valuation in our community between 2003 and 2013, we've had some pretty significant fluctuation. But for the first 5 years, we were on an uptick, and that was fairly constant, where we had historically been for years and years and decades in Johnson County. Maybe small incremental growth, but that property tax and that property valuation was trending upward. You see that we hit our high point really in 2006, and then we saw a decline in that, and then it sort of dropped off fairly significantly in the last 5 years. Now we are seeing a small uptick with what the assessor has been out and shared with us earlier this year. But I don't know that we will ever recover to the levels that we were back in that 2006 without some major investments and some increases in density and some other things that will really add more value to our community.
Can I ask just a question? To do a compare and contrast on delinquent property tax, and you've got your budget for 2015 is 15,000. And for 14 it's 15,000. Are those, that's not all the properties that are delinquent, that's just the potential that you plan to collect, right?
It's an average.
How would we know what the comparison is if we're, putting our direction in the right network?
If you go to the second half of this sheet that we're just looking at, this shows you property tax levies and collections for the last 10 years. So it'll show you total tax, what we levied to the county, what we collected, and the percentage rate. So you can see that on average, we've had one sort of outlier year where we collected 92.5%. But on average, we're collecting 98% of the taxes that we levy. So delinquent collections for us isn't a significant issue. So that's kind of a historical way that we look at that. So we've seen declining in the last several years. We've seen a decline in assessed valuation overall. At that same time, if you think about from this sheet what we've done with the city's mill levy, we've also brought our mill levy down in that same corresponding period. Now, we did that very consciously because we started to shift to increases in the utility fees. So that was very deliberate. So you have several factors, though, that are working and influencing your property tax collection. So you've got decreasing assessed valuation, and you've got a decrease in the mill levies. So we see a downward trend in property tax. Same thing with motor vehicle tax. On the city sales and use tax side, and county sales and use tax, so what comes into the general fund on sales tax is just the 1%. That we collect sales and use tax. The $0.25 for streets goes into a separate fund, is dedicated, may only be used for certain purposes, and the Parks and Recreation sales tax does not come into this fund. So this is treated as our 1% general city sales tax. We've actually, when the mall went dark and was demolished back in 2005, if you go back and look at the notes there, we made some very specific adjustments for that loss of revenue. We've actually recovered with the other things that we've added, and we're actually at or above levels that we were when the mall was actually still open. Now, what we haven't seen is really significant growth in sales tax.
That mall, why isn't that reflected in that total assessed value over there?
It is probably when you see that that mall came down.
That property had to be worth a lot of money at one point, didn't it?
Actually, what happened is the assessed value on that property went up, as I recall, Martin. When they demolished it, it actually went up.
Really?
Because it was so depressed, if you will, that the appraiser looked at that and said it's more valuable as a vacant piece of ground, even in a floodplain,
Interesting.
than where that was. So that's why you didn't see, and that all happened in that 2005, 2006.
Yeah, I was kind of looking for a dip there, but I
Yeah,
thought
so
that was
actually
going
it
to
was
worth several
a little
million.
counterintuitive there, but
I mean, for me, you reiterate what you said, so I just think it was important right before I asked this question regarding revenue generation disposed from that property.
yes, so we've actually, we planned for that decrease in revenue when we put the budget together in that year. And then slowly, since the loss of that revenue, we haven't seen a continued sort of backsliding, if you will. We've been able to fill that gap and actually exceed that after the mall. So our other sales tax revenues have stepped in. Now, I will tell you, we can't provide, we're prohibited from providing specific sales tax generation numbers for any individual business. That's not something that we can do. If you look in the back of your CAFR, we categorize it by types of business. We just started doing that about 3 years ago. That was a new addition. And I didn't copy that page. But historically in Mission, one of our biggest sales tax generators is utilities. So you pay, not only do you pay franchise fee, you're also paying sales tax on your gas and your electric and all of that. So that's a big category. But I'll pull that page for the future, but it's interesting because if you look at that page, we're really fairly balanced, which is a good place to be. We have some fairly equal buckets, if you will, in terms of grocery and discount retailers, and we're light on automotive sales. Surprise, surprise. And so if you pull that same sheet from the City of Marion's budget, they're going to be incredibly strong in sales tax generated by auto sales. And so that's an important, I was excited to see that addition to the CAFR because it helps us look at and compare ourselves to other communities to understand, but it also helps us think about the types of businesses that we may want to attract or where we might be more vulnerable in times of economic downturn. Because we have the Target and the grocery store and some places where people are still spending their dollars even in a recession, we don't necessarily see as much of a downturn in our sales tax revenues as other communities. So although we're still sales tax dependent in the general fund, in terms of the distribution of our sales tax providers, we're fairly equally balanced, and that's a real positive. Franchise taxes, again, that's a 5% fee that is charged on your utility bills, and that has remained fairly constant. You see some fluctuation depending on if there are major rate increases through the utility providers, and weather can sometimes play a factor in that. So within the top half of the revenue stream, so as we look at the budget, we think about what are the revenue streams that we can control. So we control mill levy, which impacts our property tax revenue streams. We could put sales tax in front of the voters. We have up to the 2% capacity, but I mean, I think we've looked at with the dedicated sales tax, we've opted to use sales tax for dedicated infrastructure purposes rather than continuing to increase our general fund sales tax. But that is always an option, and that you look at. It does require a vote of the public. Franchise taxes, we are at the maximum amount that can be charged in that. So short of things that are within the utility company control, we don't have a lot of control there. So then we move down into the next set of revenue line items, licenses and permits. That's our building permit. Business licenses, actually that's primarily business licenses.
So we don't anticipate that increasing, but Johnson Drive being complete at the end of 2014. Do we actually anticipate a decrease?
I
don't think it'll happen that quick.
Yeah, I don't know that it would happen that quick. I think that's being conservative, and this is actually based more on actual collections from 13. We had bumped that number up, I think, in the 14 budget, looking at business licenses at the gateway. So the $150,000 is probably more realistic without that project. So there can be some tinkering. The other thing that we do, because we're required by the state to submit a budget by August 25th, I mean, there's a lot that can happen in our world between now and when this budget actually goes into effect. So we tend to be very conservative on both the revenue side and the expenditure side, and hope to do better in both cases by the time we get to the end of the year. Johnson County Plan Review and Inspection fees, that is, we collect those, and a lot of those are passed through fee. Martin, can you help me? I never remember the percentages.
It's about 2/3. 2/3 of what we collect is paid to Johnson County Planning and Code Services. 2/3 to 70%.
So we estimate that revenue stream based on historical activity and any projects that we know may be coming down the horizon in a particular year. Charges for services is a strange category, but police fines. Sorry, I skipped over that. Let's start with police fines.
We bump up the 1.4 mil for the gateway.
On police fines?
Yeah.
No, actually, if you look at the collections, if you look at our actual collections in 2013, this chart that I handed out, this combines your forecasts and your fine revenue. We separate them out on this worksheet, so it's a little hard to see. We were closer to 1.6 million, 1.5 million in that fine number in actual collections for 12, for example. So when we put the 14 budget together, we knew we were seeing a decrease in activity. And so we started over the last couple of years in the budget process to bring that number down and try to match that up with what we were seeing in terms of the citation activity. So if you go back to this big sheet with the fine and fee revenue that's highlighted, in 2009, that 2.1 million. So obviously the fines then are generating court costs, so those two kind of come together to make up this number that you see in our audit. So that was based on about 20,700 citations that were issued. We issued 10,700 citations in 2013. So there's a significant drop. I mean, so, and if you even look at from 12 to 13, we went from 15,360 citations to 10,700. So that number has been coming down dramatically over the last several years. Again, we've been trying to account for that in the budget process as we've gone through. And we've had some conversations previously about trying to establish where that new normal is and where we find that balancing point, if you will, between traffic safety. And it's not about generating these kinds of numbers. The issue is when you had that sort of revenue stream in your budget, you have to be able to plan for and thoughtfully account for adjusting to that, just like you would for what's in sales tax revenue or property tax revenue.
So I got a question. On the, like 2009 there, looking at the police fines and fees, just above that, you got the charges for services that were 2.8 million.
Yeah. Charges for services on this sheet in the CAFR, because
That's
this is
different
all
from this
fund.
sheet.
This is, yeah.
But look at it. I mean, I know the fines went down in 2013, but the charges for services went up.
And charges for
$2.5
services
million.
on this sheet is primarily stormwater and transportation utilities. Is where they show up on this in the CAFR.
Okay.
That's where this is all of our funds combined, and that's why it's hard sometimes to do that direct connection about those things that are coming into the general fund. So those charges for services here, which is why if you look at 11, you see in 10 we had that 2.7 million, and in 11 we bumped up the stormwater utility fee significantly, and we added the transportation utility fee. So you see that big jump there in 11, and then 13 is really more reflective of the additional increase in the stormwater ERD for the Johnson Revenue Center. So yes, charges for services on this sheet means something completely different than charges for
Well,
services.
I figured it had to. Like what the heck?
Yes.
Can I just take the police fines that potentially they might be a little bit more in 2015 given hopefully increased traffic down Johnson Drive, just more people driving down it, which is inherently.
I don't know if people are much more careful than this. I know I am. You know, I mean,
Well, they're
I don't want it
in all other cities too, so.
yeah, definitely, Paola.
Parkville,
Sure.
Riverside,
Heck, yeah,
just
or they
every
text me
list.
every time.
Mission.
And I have a question about the police funds. Do we give them a number we want them to reach?
No.
So we're not giving them any number of,
It's against the law.
I'm asking what? I just want to know I just want to know the law there. Can you explain it to me? Because the river is out, the river bill is out, that we give them a certain amount of money, and if they have to bring them so much money in funds. So can you just tell me what we do to know that?
We have never from upstairs said you will generate X amount of money in traffic funds. Okay?
Or number of tickets.
Or number of tickets.
No.
What we have said to them is if you're going to have a philosophical shift in how you're approaching traffic enforcement, we can't go from 1,000 tickets a month, 1,800, whatever that number has been historically, to 300 tickets a month in the blink of an eye in a current budget year without an opportunity to plan and react and respond to that. So we need to be having the conversations about what is our philosophy, and again, those are the conversations that I know I have had, that I know Jerry has had with the police department as it relates to number of tickets or records. Now, we track that so that we can begin to see. So, for example, part of why we look at citations and the corresponding revenue is if I'm writing a ticket for a seatbelt violation or an equipment violation, that's less expensive. That bumps my numbers up,
Right.
but it's less expensive than if I'm really writing a speeding ticket that may have a $110 fine associated with it. So again, we've heard the council and the community talk about, if we focus our efforts on traffic safety, then we are, these tickets at 10,724 and probably somewhere a little bit higher are those tickets which are, those are people that are legitimately speeding through this community. Those are people that are running stop signs. So that's why you don't see a corresponding percentage decrease. When you lose 10,000 tickets, you don't have a corresponding percentage decrease in revenue. And that's part of what you have to look at. And we're balancing those kinds of things out. This number, if you look at this number compared to other communities in Marion or Cray Village, that 10,000 to 12,000 ticket range is probably more consistent with what we see in other communities. I don't know that that means anything other than, we then really have to say, we shared, for example, in the annual report, high accident locations. So are we allocating our resources to the high accident locations? Are we able to impact and bring those numbers down? So again, it's not about a dollar amount. The only reason it becomes about a dollar amount is because just like if it were sales tax or property tax, we've built a budget around that number. And so if those numbers change, we need to be able to plan for and thoughtfully account for.
No, you know what? I think everybody wants to be safe community. And you keep a safe community by keeping the police out there. We can't have budgets like said in this system, but you can aggressively enforce. So, and that's what has to be said. You aggressively.
I mean, like when I went on a ride-along, the officers have made a comment that typically they don't give a citation unless you're going over 11 over. I think 11 over is very generous
Very
for
nice. It needs to be 6.
individual. But that's what you hear from that's what you hear from insurance.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that generally, if they're just driving along by themselves, not disturbing anything, generally it's 11 over. So, I mean, if there's so it sounds like there's philosophy such as that can, yield certain revenue, expectations. I think it would probably be acceptable, if it was 5 over. So I think there's ways, and then when you look at is 11 over really causing damage or safety issues for the community and things like that. So I think there's
If you change it from 11 over to 8 over, you probably see a good increase in revenue there.
So
That was out having during the campaign, but I also, when I got home the other day, it was 11 minutes, it was called. She left me 2 messages, just really packed up. And then she went through this whole scenario again about, well, the place is so stretched and many tickets, and I'm just.
that's just the general.
I know, that's why I told her, but some people do just.
Excuse me, Laura. Does the department understand that this is a projection and more or less a placeholder, like the projected revenue will generate from the police fines, and that open communication is encouraged if they're not going to achieve that certain numbers? They don't feel the necessity to then go and bump up their numbers.
well, and that's why we look at, we look at and track on a monthly basis where we are both in terms of citations and in terms of, and if you look at, I've got it charted 3 years worth of history. There are certain times of the year, summertime, springtime, summertime, our ticket numbers go up, and they have historically. People are out there, about there, kind of, the numbers are historically lower in the wintertime. And so, yes, so we look at that, but we have that conversation on an ongoing basis, again, because if we're seeing trends, we need time to react and respond to that and think about, okay, so if we're down, maybe we were planning to buy some capital equipment in this quarter, and maybe we need to hold off on the purchase of that capital equipment until, and that's the same thing with, with really every department that has a specific revenue stream. We do the same thing with, property tax is easy, we get it twice a year, and so we sort of know what that is. Sales tax, we see some fluctuations at different times of the year, and we need to make sure we understand that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Susie brought up a good point, and it exists. I think I just didn't want to take it for granted and assume that the communication and dialogue is happening without, getting confirmation or follow-up.
Well, and I don't think, if you look at the 2009 levels, I don't think anybody in this room or in this building actually has a sustainable level of traffic enforcement in a community this size. I mean, that's just, it's not. But if you then look at that and say, so we've brought that number down consistently, and at 10,000, at roughly half that 5 years later, we've heard some of that message, right? We've heard we need to bring this and be evaluating that. It's something we'll continue to talk about.
Can I ask a question about that? Do we have any kind of leverage on the amount of fine? In other words, I don't know how we do it now, but if there's 10 miles over, you pay a certain fine, can you raise that by 20%?
The judge sets, there's a fine schedule that's set by the state, and the judge has some latitude.
The state has, okay, that's a,
And it's pretty hefty.
Yes.
Just letting you know, it's not
so every city in Kansas is the same on their.
Not every city, but the judge, and we get some more information in terms of how those are impacted. We do have some latitude, but not a lot.
Okay.
So we do have, and it is in the general thought from the hierarchy that it's public safety and not, you just track the revenue, you get what you get from public safety, but, and let you know the state.
I think something that would be beneficial for us as a city is this is a point of debate on an ongoing basis. And when the Kansas City Star ran their article last year and called out that we had an inordinately high number of citations in our city, and the comment was it's apples to oranges, it's not apples to apples. I think it's beneficial for us as a city and for our police department for us to get to a point where we have an apples to apples comparison. I think it's just important that we're able to substantiate that our issuance of citations and fines is comparable to other cities of our size, right? So to say that we're issuing how many 10,000 citations and that isn't what Marion does, that's not, kind of apples to oranges, right? But just looking at per capita, looking at number of cars that travel through the city during the day, and then kind of what's the ratio of citations that are given. To me, that's just information that you keep, you maintain, you have it in the back of your pocket. So if this ever comes up, and it was just literally on the news this morning or yesterday about Kansas City, Missouri has increased, I think, 20 or 30%, right? And their accident rates have gone down, their crime rates have gone down. So just keeping that in the back of our pocket and just keeping track of it just helps us. We're not defensive and we're not scrambling. It's just a way of doing business. And we're constantly making sure that we are number one safety, and we're monitoring, we're gauging this against safety. I think it was great how Kansas City, Missouri also included the number of thefts, robberies, and burglaries. I didn't even think about that, right? But again, the presence of the police on the street is going to have a spillover effect with that. So I think keeping those things and having, accurate information at our fingertips that helps us defend our stance and where we're at, it's just right there.
Definitely, because that is a perception out there that the police force in Mission has been fighting for years, and that's one thing I hear from a lot of people in my ward is that they feel like they're being preyed upon, and they feel like it's predatory. They feel that's the way they feel. May not be a fact, but that is the way they feel. And so I really would like to change that, feeling between the police force.
I think Dave brought up last month too with some of the comments he heard were, as it relates to safety, speeding was not, people were not upset about them. They were upset that they had a white out and they didn't get a warning, they got a ticket. They had their turn signal, didn't go, they had it on the right and they were turning left, they got a ticket instead of a warning. That was a concern that he's been, that's been voiced to us last month.
And if you look at, I mean, we have the ability in our ticket system, and we break down the actual citation that was given. So, I mean, I will tell you, because I look at those every month, the number of citations that we write, I mean, there may be defective equipment, but it's typically proved with speeding or something else. So the number of kind of standalone defective equipment type of tickets, and that is something that we've talked about. Some of the other cities, you know, are completely waiving that if you get your taillight fixed or you do whatever, you bring that back and check it. So there's some, you know, some other things that we can do to improve that image, and that we are absolutely.
Because you want to ensure people on the outside of the city, as well as people on the inside, if they're going down the street for speeding, that's one thing. If there's just something a little off, we want them to come back and shop here and do business here and procure services here.
Yep, and so I think what I really wanted to just highlight, and I know we've talked about it before, was that because we did hear it a lot throughout the campaign process, and we hear it a lot for the last several years, but we have brought those numbers down very, very, very dramatically. And so I think what you will see happening is some tweaking around probably that $10,000 range, but I don't think that it's realistic to think. I think we will lose on many of those other fronts if we start to push below that. I mean, that seems to be probably a natural point, but we need to continue to collect the data and evaluate that and look at that.
Right, because just because people complain about it, we shouldn't be lowering our fire. Again, we
Right.
shouldn't be
Right.
compromising safety.
Right, and the taillights and headlights, I mean, that's, so much of that's going to be common sense, case by case, subjective, but we have to trust our law enforcement officers to enforce the law. I agree.
Right. So there's operational philosophical decisions that happen in that department, just like there are in every other department, but they have real budgetary impacts. So that's really kind of, you know, as we look and move through this, we just have to learn to adjust to that. Miscellaneous and other is truly just that. It's a giant catch-all category for anything else that might come in over the course of a year. That might be equipment that we sell that's being surplus, that we get revenues for. That might be, for example, we just issued the IRBs on the Aspen Village project and we made $41,500 in fees. That's the kind of thing that might go into that one. So you may see some fluctuation there, and so that's just kind of a guess. We tend to be very conservative there. Pool revenues are just that. Those reflect revenues at the outdoor pool. We'll be anxious to get through the end of this season and really see. This is an increase at $100,000 in the 14 budget, and we collected more in the probably $50,000 to $55,000 range at our old pool. So this is a fairly aggressive number based on what the consultants told us. And she's looking at Christy. Yes. So we'll see, and that's one we'll have to look at and evaluate. Park special event revenues, this is what we charge for our day camp. This is our summer day camp program. We actually see a decrease there. Again, this is a number, we last year shortened up our camp time frame by 1 week. In order to allow us to really get our staff here, because they're coming typically from colleges and high schools, to get them out of school, get them trained before we, as Christy was saying, their number one concern is safety of the campers that we have. That had a little bit of an impact on the revenue, so we need to continue to watch that, but I believe that program covers its costs.
Oh, it covers
And exceeds its costs, and so we'll share that as we get through. Typically we'll bring that forward, but that is kind of a standalone program within the department that covers its costs each year. Mission Square pilots, this is a payment in lieu of taxes that Mission Square makes to us. When we sold the portion of the community center parking lot, Mission Square is a 501c3 corporation, so if they had built that piece of property on ground that was not owned by the city, they would not be paying any property tax to the city. We were able, because we owned that piece of ground and sold it to them, to negotiate through the real estate contract for payment in lieu of taxes. So this essentially sort of keeps us whole and kind of unique way. We don't have that opportunity because we don't own every piece of ground, but I think just an example of how we try to make sure as we look at
Is that a permanent thing?
it's permanent. So it's a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Transfer of Parks and Recreation sales tax revenues, that's one, we aren't showing anything currently in the 2015 budget. We'll continue to kind of talk about that. You made a decision last year to transfer $100,000 of sales tax revenues into the general fund for operations. I'm not sure we have that much flexibility when we look at the capital budget, but that's something that we'll come back to as we marry those up. So that's a place where we could add some money if you choose. Community center revenues, we are seeing some decreases in revenues there. But one of the things that you do if you go to your budget resolution and it talks about is item number 7 on your general fund fact sheet. Several years ago, we did a performance audit of the community center. We benchmarked it against other surrounding centers and trying to determine what an appropriate cost recovery goal for the facility might be. And when we got through that process, the council adopted an 80% of annual operating expenses, so it doesn't include capital, was the goal that was set. So every year when we put a budget together, Christy's got to look at what our revenue projections are and what our expense projections are and get us to that 80%, and then we do our best to manage that throughout the course of the year. So when we put the 14 budget together, the budget on paper was an 82% cost recovery. If we add in the $100,000 that we brought over in sales tax revenues, it was an 87%. So that's something that we continue to talk about, think about, try to understand. If you, again, I didn't bring this tonight because I felt like I was throwing it after it, but if you go back to your CAFR that you had from the last meeting on table 17 in the statistical section, it's a lot of operating indicators by function and program. And if you look there, it gives you in leisure and recreation, it'll be page 64 of the audit. We detail annual memberships sold and the revenue that's generated by that, facility reservations processed and the revenue, pool memberships sold and the pool revenue. So if you look at, for example, memberships, the highest memberships sold in any given year in the last, since 2006, was in 2010. Is at 2,871. So from 2009 to 2010, we essentially increased the number of memberships by 300, and we decreased the membership revenue by $10,000. So this is the kind of information that we look at every year and try to figure out what are the moving pieces. Do we have the right membership rates? Do we have the right classifications? You know, what are we seeing? So we've seen a downward trend since 2006 in total membership revenue, although our highest point was in 2006 at just slightly over $1 million, but we only had 937 memberships. In 2013, we had 2,400 memberships for $854,000. So there are lots of strings and pieces that we look at that. Facility reservations, the same thing. Our highest number was in 2006 at almost 2,000 for $168,000 worth of revenue. We had half the number of reservations in 2013, and we made $20,000 more in revenue on an annual basis. So there's not a direct correlation necessarily. There's a lot of things that have to be considered there, but that's an area that we look at daily, weekly, monthly, annually, in how to make that cost, how to make that cost recovery goal, and is that the appropriate cost recovery goal. And I know that the Mayor's Task Force that you talked about at the meeting last month, you know, is going to look at some of those issues and kind of dusting off that performance audit and you know, are we benchmarking against the right things? What opportunities do we have? Is this the appropriate cost recovery goal for that? So that gets us kind of through the revenue side. If I go back to the general fund fact sheet, I think that kind of fits that. If we move then just very generally to the expenditure side, And this is just, again, our first pass of departments through the general fund budget. So the numbers that you see here are based on current staffing levels, current programs and services that are being delivered in 2014. So no change in total number of employees. And you see a little bit of a growth in personnel services. Again, we tend to do better by the end of the year in personnel services, but part of our challenge is we are projecting for increases in retirement, mandatory retirement, and our health insurance in August that we won't negotiate until October and November. So we try to build some cushion into the budget every year, hoping that we can do better at negotiation time, but we'd rather show it a little high, come in better, and have to come back to you all and say in November, December, hey, do you want to amend your budget to do this or not? So as you can see, I mean, that personnel services, biggest portion of the expenditure. Contractual services are those things that we go outside of the organization to buy. So legal services, planning services, carpet, rug cleaning, anything that we go out and purchase from someone else is captured in contractual services. Commodities are actually goods that you can kind of touch and feel your hands on. That's the best way to think about that. So gas, cleaning supplies, salt, sand. That's the difference between those two categories. Capital outlay is equipment and vehicles for everything but the community center. We've shifted the capital equipment for the community center to the Parks and Recreation sales tax, which has provided tremendous relief in the general fund. You see a big decrease in capital outlay between 2014 and 2015, and this number will be refined again. 2014, we had $100,000 of that is for replacement of financial management software. Yes, let's hope. And so I can have Excel spreadsheets. RC was asking me about Excel spreadsheets. I said, well, I have to tell you the format that most of my budget documents are in. But and then there was a lot of we've really extended the life of a lot of our police fleet, with the exception of the Tahoes that were purchased 3 years ago. And so there was a big investment there. We're in the process of going through and making sure that we have a clear plan for replacement of the police fleet. So, and that's really what bumped the numbers up significantly in the 14 budget. In the 15 budget, and there were 2 trucks, I think, in the public works department. In 15, there just wasn't much on the schedule. Replacement of the street sweeper would be kind of on the schedule. We would lease that instead of an outright purchase, and a few other things. So we'll kind of refine that number. But that one, we try to not have significant peak. We don't like to have peaks and valleys like this. And the financial management software really kind of took that one up this year. Debt service is the debt service that is now shown in the general fund for the purchase of the streetlight system. And so we actually save money and we're able to pay the debt service, pay the electricity costs, and generate, I think, about $120,000 worth of savings annually. It's a 10-year debt issue, so once that is paid off, we should see an even bigger spike in that. But that's what that debt service number is. And then the contingency reserves and transfers right now in the general fund is the transfer that we make to subsidize the balance of the residential solid waste contract. So if you go back to your general fund fact sheet, item number 4/5, because I don't know how to take things out. So right now we contract with Deaf and Baugh for service to 2,967 households for an annual contract of about $562,000. Property owners pay, so that total, it's $15.79 a month. So the total bill would be $189.48 annually per household. Right now, we assess $163.08 of that back to the individual homeowners, or $13.59 a month, and that's paid on the, shows up as a line item under real estate tax bill. And so the city is paying basically $2.20 a month, or between $78,000 and $80,000 to cover the cost of that service. So that kind of gets us to the total expenditures as they stand today. What we know is that this council wants to see a budget where revenues exceed expenditures. So again, we know we have work to do, right? So we hear, we pay attention, we listen. So then if we go down to the fund balance at December 31st, you see a 25% decrease in fund balance. We know that's not acceptable. Again, we wanted to show you kind of where we sit today and the challenges that we're going to have, and kind of highlight some of the conversations that we'll have. The other thing I do want to go back to and the fund balance goals, and we started some of this conversation a month or so ago. So right now you have a council policy that says you have a fund balance goal of 25% of general fund revenues. So in the 2014 budget, if we were to be at that 25% goal, I've shown you what that number would need to be. It would be $2.5 million roughly. I think Jerry in the 5-year financial forecast started to lay out or say, do we want to think about, is 25% an appropriate fund balance goal? Particularly as we've shifted a lot of these things off to other revenue streams on the infrastructure side, because we don't right now have a fund balance policy in tied to any of our infrastructure revenues. So when we're that heavy in revenue being generated by those, we probably need to think about fund balance policies in both places. This 25% was established back when you were sending significant amounts of money out of the general fund to pay for infrastructure expenses.
And Laura, was some of that, some concerns that they were having when they were wondering if we were going to have to bond out
I
that
think,
project and
yeah, I think one of the things,
to a bank.
yeah, one of the things that the rating agencies look at is our general fund balance. And I know, and I will continue this conversation because we need to be sensitive to what that appropriate level is. But if I go to Government Finance Officers Association and look at their best practices as it relates to fund balance, generally the literature is going to suggest that you want to have somewhere between 5 and 15% or 2 to 3 months of operating expense. So our policy exceeds that, and I think that's a positive thing, right? But I think that's worth having a conversation, and again, double checking that with our financial advisor and the rating agencies to make sure we're not jeopardizing anything we have. But if we have the opportunity to adjust that or bring that more in line with other cities, you know, that 25% goal may or may not be something that we want to have. If you look at the $1.5 million where we are today, which is about 16%, and that's between 2 and 3 months of operating reserve. So we have that in the bank, and we maintain that in the bank right now. So right now, even though we aren't at our council policy goal, we are certainly within the range of best practices, which I think you've seen reflected in our rating agencies, right?
But they were telling us previously that we needed to increase our fund balance.
Because we said, and part of that is we have a policy.
We had set the limits, and
yes,
we had
and
not.
so we've told them we're trying to get here, and so they're pushing us to meet our own policy, not necessarily dictating what that policy needs to be. Now, we could
So it
say,
wasn't necessary for issuance of those bonds.
well, they want to see us making progress to, what we did is we took a chunk out of fund balance to restructure debt. And what they want you to do is when you're impacting a fund balance, they want you to be very clear and transparent in why you did that, and they want you to have a plan for how you're going to recover that. And what we've told them is that according to our current policy, we're trying to get back to this our goal is 25%, which is where we were before we did this specific drawdown of the funds. What I'm saying is we may want to explore is that 25, if our policy had been 20% and we'd drawn down and we were getting back to 20%, I'm not sure that would have impacted our bond rating. They want to see us moving in the direction of the policy.
I'm sorry, I guess I was understanding Pete to say that to issue those bonds and to make us look more financially viable, that he wanted to see that.
And they would. They want you to see you moving in the direction of your policy.
But it was more for policy, not because we didn't have.
But I think it's appropriate again because we've got now these other revenue streams to say, maybe it's okay to bring that down to 20% in the general fund, and maybe we want to have a 5% fund balance policy in some of the infrastructure. Because that's what we're using. You're not paying debt service out of your general fund. And the bond rating agencies are interested in the reserves that you're building and your ability to repay that debt service. So they're going to be focused on what are you doing to protect your ability to make debt service payments, right? So they would be happy.
So you'd be happy either way.
Yes.
And why would we have reserve in our debt service funds? Why wouldn't we just spend that money and pay down our debt? Why would we reserve them?
Well, we don't have any requirements right now, but what you want to do is when you're paying debt with sales tax, you want to be able to be conservative, because if you have a fluctuation in the economy, so, right?
What about the revenue stream? So you're not
The
talking
revenue
about
stream
the,
would decrease, that's what her point is. So
Yes.
having a
You're not-
reserve.
you're not talking about stormwater utility fee, the tough money.
Not necessarily, it's more the sales tax, it's really more the sales tax.
And I mean, the other thing, you could be talking about the stormwater or the TAP, if something becomes delinquent,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
You don't want to be right at no reserves at all, and then you have a revenue, a default on revenue, and then you have nothing to make up for it. So I think it does make sense. To me, it seems like almost robbing Peter to pay Paul, but,
True.
at the end of the day, it's we want excess reserves somewhere.
Right. You want it somewhere, and you want it, keeping it in your general fund gives you the greatest amount of flexibility,
Right.
because you aren't tied to being able to spend it on a limited purpose. But I think it's worth, when you're talking about closing $1 million gap in a fund balance policy, that's a lot of money for this city.
Yeah, I don't, personally, I like the idea of leaving it at the 25%, mainly because you just said, they want you to have 3 months
Right.
reserve. 3 months reserve is 25%. That's 1/4 of the year. So I'm sure there's little tweaks in there here and there, but it's going to be really close to that. So yeah, I'd hate to see us make a move to change our goal to 20% because we're trying to finagle a few numbers. I'd still like to see us keep it to 25%. That's me personally.
Sure.
And the rest of the people.
I personally am okay with 20, given the historical performance and the fact that we have yet to be able to reach 25. But that being said, I
We
would.
haven't reached 20.
Well, right. We're supposed to be, so 20 still, my point is 20 is still a stretch, right?
Right.
25 is a really big stretch, and if it potentially impacts us negatively from our rating agencies. That being said, that 5% needs to go to the other fund balances, and we need to have policies in place. So I don't know. Again, correct me wrong.
She's saying those rating agencies want you to be striving, as long as you have a goal, it's the 25%, and you're striving for that, they take that into account. But if your
Well,
goal was 15%, they're not going to be happy with that. Hey, they hit their goal. Yeah,
Well,
that's not where we
That's
want them
best
to be.
practice. I mean, best practice is 5 to 15. Isn't that what you said?
yeah, but also
Which is
best
about 3
practice is
months.
3 months.
Well,
You have to do what fits the character of, of your community, and I don't think, I just think it's worth thinking about, talking about, because, for example, if you look at where we ended 13, we missed our revenue projections, primarily because of a reduction in fine revenue by almost $300,000, okay? But we managed the expenditure side of that. We didn't spend to the approved budget on that side. So we still added $200 and some odd thousand to the general fund balance in 2013. That, so we're very cognizant of not just, spending because it's been in an approved budget, because we understand you also have this goal of needing to rebuild fund balance. $211,000 is a lot of money that, for our city
That's more money than I make in a week.
and our budget. So again,
Ever in your entire life.
so that's really where, where we are. Jerry can probably talk a little bit about the plan for, we'll continue to meet with department heads and bring back we'll begin to start to make some recommendations about how we proceed to close.
I think the bottom line is we definitely want to keep trying to build the general fund balance. I don't think in the next 2 years it's going to spring up to 25% where we have to worry about, maybe we should cut it back down to 20. Let's just
Keep going.
plan on trying to increase that, and then as things develop in the city down the road, as you have a tendency to do, then we relook at things and say, hey,
Because
it's
I
looking
think
better,
having,
things are rolling, let's set up a couple other fund balances for these other.
Or even doing donations.
Well, is there any risk with trying to close a $1 million gap if it's not realistic in the short term? With keeping 25% in essence, if we know that we're having problems reaching 20. I think what Pat says, as long as there's no risk,
Right.
maintaining the status quo or going after 25, I think it's a good idea. In the short term, we're going to be.
I think right now, and I think as we work through this budget process and have some more conversations about the gateway, part of what we needed to do is preserve this at around $1.5 million at least to keep us where we needed to be for issuance of the gateway bonds. So as we look at this bottom fund balance number needing to not dip below the $1.5 million that we've been for the last 2 years. Probably not realistic based on the other things that we're seeing to grow it much beyond that. But I think we need to try to be at that number, which then makes it, we're really talking probably about $400,000. Now, the other thing again that we haven't shown on here is we have that mill that's currently on Criminal Park, which the debt will be paid off, so you could reassign that mill someplace else. That's not shown in these projections again. I said I didn't want to assume where we wanted to show that.
That's paid off this year.
Yeah. So that mill, without having to increase the mill levy, we recover about $120,000 that you can apply somewhere in an existing budget.
I think one thing that we need to take into consideration, and I don't know how realistic this is, but I think it's a risk, is as we approach Gateway Developers and Tom Valenti about assessing a special district to them. I think given the fact of the lack of movement on that project, I think there's a real possibility that he will come back and ask for more money. He'll ask to change the project, and he'll look for more city funding. I think the minute we assess that special benefit district, he will come to us and say, look, I need you to change some things, and that probably will include increasing the debt. So that impacts, right? I mean, it could be directly relational to or impacted by the amount of fund balance we have per se, if we're going to consider issuing more debt. I just think that I'm not asking anybody to make any decisions based on that. I think that that's just a real possibility to keep in the back of our mind, and then knowing that the $1.5 million general fund balance is somewhat related to the potential existing debt issuance for the district.
So if you look at your budget policy again, last year we were specific to say we wanted to maintain a general fund balance. It's item number 5 from $1.5 million, and I think that's good. I think this budget resolution helps us communicate to a variety of different places what those policies are. So we'll fill in, all of those things as we go along.
And then one other thing that was a lot of controversy last year that we probably may revisit again this year is increasing to take that $2.20 for this management fee or the residential trash service and put that all on. Again, that's only $80,000 ish, but that's $80,000 consideration. Maintenance $50 a year. You know, budgets are tight. That's the only increase we make. That's just something to consider.
I think it would be $26.40 annually per year, right? So $2.20 a month times 12 months. They're already paying their. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess what I'd be interested in hearing is, again, that's why I wanted to give you the budget resolution that outlines a lot of the policies that talk about all of these things that we've talked about in the past and where we've landed. For you all to start thinking about, when we're trying to balance a budget, you can increase the revenues, you can decrease the expenditures. And you can decrease the expenditures by consolidating services, eliminating services, the whole variety of things that can happen there. We, I think, heard you loud and clear last year that you wanted us to really look at all of those things, but a lot on, the expense reduction side. What we want to be very deliberate this year when we're talking about these kinds of numbers, it does have real service. You can't have real service delivery impact. So if there are things that you want us to consider and evaluate as we start into this budget process, if you can share those as early as you possibly can. The more time we have to gather the information and get you back what you need. So I don't know if anybody has things tonight.
Do you have options? Do you have a list of options?
Just asking for it.
We will definitely, and we'll have a lot of options of our own. If there are things that you want to make sure to get on an option list this year, let us know. So there may be some things that we haven't thought of.
Do you have really big ticket items we're looking at, other than ADA accessibility for this building, or the community center, or public works building, any kind of big ticket items in the next 3 to 5 years that we'll be looking at? I mean, whether it be carpeting, flooring.
Yeah, you have all kinds of facility issues here in this building. Yeah, I think we estimated that really accounted for the roof. You have some ADA funds that are set aside at about $75,000. Those are shown right now in this total fund balance number. So understand that spending all of those would reduce the fund balance and it's carried there as a restricted fund balance. But there's some money to do that. I think that, yes, there are improvements here. There are ongoing capital equipment needs and that sort of
Since you mentioned it, what else, besides what you just now mentioned, is included in that fund balance that is?
nothing. That's the only thing that has any sort of restriction.
That's scary.
Laura, one thing I'm curious about, when they look into it for us, or Jeremy, and then the answer, the city paying a portion of Laura, that you referenced is $2.20 a month for the residential trash service. Is that, at least with neighboring municipalities, and I don't even know if that's the best way to go about looking at it, is that common?
Isn't it?
I will look. In fact, I started to pull, and so as we move forward, I know that Prairie Village and Fairway and Northern Park, I think now all assess a trash fee on their bills, and so I didn't have a chance before tonight to contact them, but I'll make those contacts and see. Does that cover 100%?
They even have additional services like for leaf pickup.
Right. So we'll get kind of an apples to apples about what are we paying versus who's paying that versus how is that being shared.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before. First of all, that we have big trash pickups every month, the first of every month. Really do that. And then I think if I recall correctly, a lot of the cities assess 100% of this collection to the residents. So the fact that we don't, we used to pay 100%. Yeah, we used to pay 100% of it. The fact that we pay, we subsidize this at all, it's just
I did get something from a constituent back in March on, he sent his tax bill from 2002 to 2013, and his taxes had gone up. Yes, mine.
I'm guessing I have the same tax bill.
Yes, so it's not that we have not increased the burden
Right.
on.
Yes, it's reflected right here.
Yeah, well, with the mill levy, yeah.
Yeah, the mill levy used
The
to
mill
be
levy-
5, and
right.
now it's 11.
But the mill levy's actually gone down, and so it's a lot of this is fees and.
Well, 2002, Jennifer, the mill levy was 5. It's gone up. and
It
then
has,
gone
but
back down.
yeah, but it's gone back down, so not all of this is just because, you said you actually decreased the mill levy when we got increase in fees, but I just wanted to point out that something
No,
actually went
absolutely.
through and.
And it's an understanding too of saying that, that mill levy was at 5 point whatever it was for years and years and years. And even after the community center initially came online, And, we're, the residents here today who are contributing tax dollars are paying for we know this, in the utility, they're paying for the deferred infrastructure maintenance, they're paying for the fact that the budget from a revenue standpoint wasn't adjusted at the time the community center came on. So, there are all those things that accumulate over time that help contribute to those increases as well.
And you're Jeffrey bring up a great point, and I actually talked to Jerry about that, like looking at the Northeast Johnson County cities and looking at the tax bill. It's just very easy. It's all public records, right? To look at the mill levy and all the other fees, usage fees that are assessed, and to see where does Mission fall in line with the other, so there are a few things that are kind of apples to oranges. There are a few places, like I think like Olathe and water. There's something that we pay that's not, there's some things that are assessed on certain cities' taxes that aren't assessed on ours at all. But if we kind of look apples to apples.
Yes, and this starts it, but it doesn't do all that. So this is the existing mill levies that appeared on the tax bills that we paid the first half of December and second half. So this will show you on one side just our valuation compared to other cities in Johnson County and how our total mill levy is broken out by purpose. So this gives you a very quick snapshot of mill levy only. The other thing that we will do, and I have Craigville, Sherwood, Roland Park, Marion started on my desk, is breaking down that tax bill. So you can see, because our mill is still comparatively low, but when you look at the total tax bill with our utility fees, we have to look at that. The other complicating factor is who uses consolidated fire, right? So if somebody paying for a fire department within their city mill levy versus our residents are paying a separate mill levy for a fire district. See, did you not? There's another one.
So Jerry and I had talked about that and taking all of those things into consideration, and that's a percentage of assessed value, determining what are the fees and taxes being paid, see where we're at. Because with, like, the Gateway, for example, the sales tax that we levy for that area puts our sales tax like in the top, I think we're at top 1 or 2 or 3 sales tax for that specific area in the state of Kansas or something. So I think it's a very worthwhile effort, and you talked about having an intern.
I'm happy to put
Yeah, you know what I mean? And just look at comparatively with sales taxes against other, property valuation and things.
And I'm sorry, Laura, because I know that we were expecting a lot more by the end of this year. So it's a huge change not having these gates started and not yet. That's a huge situation change.
So that sheet is showing us at 11.413 as compared to like 33 mils.
And Bonner Springs is really, really unique.
Yeah, they're not a good consensus.
Okay.
Yeah, Wyandotte County is
But to go down
About
to
29.7.
36 in Edgerton, and the cities are really.
But Roland Park, for example. I mean, but the other thing you look at is if you look at this bond and interest column, so other cities are designating much higher mills to pay debt service.
Correct.
Right, and so if you go to Roland Park, if you think about 33.379, because, so Roland Park residents are also paying the levy for consolidated fire district number 2.
On top of this.
On top of this, yeah. So again, I think Amy's point is well taken in that, and we will do that. We'll try to break down, because it's not just the mill levy, it is the utility fees, it is the sales taxes, it's the total burden, if you will, that we're placing on people.
They've noticed.
Everybody.
Nobody likes to pay taxes.
Right, exactly.
I know.
You don't pay any more than you have to.
But yeah, it's not.
So again, I know that, as I've said and laughed before, this is my 9th budget, and it's never been the same process. We put a lot of things in place last year, and as Jerry has mentioned, his style and my style are a lot more similar in how to present. So we know we're putting a lot of stuff out there, but from our perspective, there's maybe a middle band in terms of policy making that we haven't lived in consistently through the budget process, and that's probably the appropriate place. So, tell us when you want more moved up out of the weeds or down from the 30,000 foot level, but that's kind of our goal, is trying to keep you more here. Give us some direction, tell us, we're going to bring back specific recommendations and cuts. But if you have questions, if there's more information that you need that we can provide, we can certainly.
This is right.
What do you want from us right now?
Motion to adjourn.
I think what you asked, Laura, is there anything that we're thinking, kind of as we've gone through this process for the last few weeks, last 2 months, anything that we're thinking kind of big ticket that we would like to see staff consider, and if so, what?
Yes.
But I do have a couple of non-related things to just kind of bring up. I was going to bring it up earlier. So, I was really surprised about there being a council meeting tonight. And I do really try to read my packet. And I was aware of all the budget stuff, and I had pulled my packet up. So when were we communicated to know we're having a council meeting tonight?
Well, we talked when we passed the ordinance, we talked about needing to have the 3 chairs selected by June. And once that ordinance was passed, I don't believe we talked beyond that. Once the ordinance was passed, we had that.
So when were we notified that we were having a council meeting tonight?
It would have been for Ms. Pack.
I think I did too. Sometime, I think I got it.
No, there was an agenda for just a meeting, and then it was.
Oh, I saw this agenda, but I don't think it's.
Yeah, there should have been a council agenda, and there was in the city administrator's report, we highlighted it in blue, so hopefully people will connect those dates.
So,
on our current site right now, there is that little icon for the calendar where you can add it. And I tried that so that I could kind of sync up my calendar, and I want to say that it did not work. Then we're going to the new website. We can make sure that with the new website, I want to say that what it was generating was like an all-day thing, and it didn't really block out the time or give me any detail. So if we could just go and click on something and sync it to our phones.
yeah, and I guess I think that since this was a complete change in process and procedure of what we've done in the past, probably a better call out and realization, because it was a holiday weekend and, all of that. So maybe if we could do a better job with communication. I don't know.
I always try to look at it, over the weekend. And it's every once in a while we do get something on Tuesday night. And Tuesday night before Wednesday meeting, it's not the best time to be getting information for a Wednesday meeting. I know you guys give sometimes massive amounts of information, and that's great. I just need, because that's a lot of work for you. Process it too. So I would really appreciate that if you could by Friday to give me the weekend.
That's all we have to ask.
Yeah, I imagine it is, and I know that. Yeah, I know we had the pool opening and we had gospel on it, and that was awesome.
I think that the other thing too, and this is something that's kind of been in the back of my mind for the last few years being a council person, is this. I think this information is all really good. But I always feel like the people in the audience are at a disadvantage because they really don't see this. They don't have a chance to look at it, to digest it. It's not included in the packet. So, this isn't online, right? So I think just given the changes to the ordinance we made this month and trying to be more transparent and include the public and give them an opportunity to make comments, I think we need to consider including some of this information.
Yep, absolutely we can. And part of it is what I think we did last year, and we just need to catch up with the budget meetings, is we created a spot on the website where, as we went through the budget process, everything that was handed out was posted there. And so I just need to go back and catch that up.
That's great. Do they all understand that we're just one is 2 people and not 2 people?
No,
I just want, 2 people at once. So
I'm doing payroll and accounts payable.
So
in addition to
no, I understand.
Yeah, but that's what we did, and I just you know, some of this as, again, because it's not a consistent process, I literally at 6 o'clock was like, oh, hey, I'm gonna go pull this, but I've got this now, and so it's easy, and I think, Mark, that's what we did last year. Whatever the packet was, and then whatever we handed out, we will scan it, and we just put it in one central place, so everything you can walk through, we'll just do that. That's,
It's very informative.
that's easy to do.
And then are we to expect Mr. Valenti next week? Okay. And then
Is
I
he
have
meeting with all of us?
at the community development committee, it'll be recorded. You can watch it on Facebook or something.
For some.
Well, right, is it live on Facebook or is it recorded? So, just if your work, you could send out a night. You probably have. And then I have another thing, just I wanted to kind of see if the council was interested in this, and I briefly brought it up last year. It wasn't very popular with certain personnel at the time, but just been kind of around Roland Park area and stuff, and I do live on 57th, and with the closing of Johnson Drive and all of that, I mean, seriously, on 57th Street, every single block has a stop sign. I don't think issues are here. I don't know.
Hard to know every street.
Or 80% of them have a stop sign. And like, I don't know.
55
It's not just
I don't, yeah. So I think that that's something that maybe we have. So I saw Roland Park, they have a lot of yields,
Yeah.
right? So it's like a yield and then it's one way kind of thoroughfare. So, I mean, I know that we have a percentage of the population who's concerned with the speed that people drive through their residential area. But I don't know that it prevents any accidents, but I think it would be great if we might consider making a harassment stops. Maybe take it.
Or you could drive around.
Well, that, because you're about the traffic, the sign.
Well, when I'm running along that street, it's just.
Because we don't have a policy, right? I mean, you're used to a policy that says.
That's what I figured.
And I
There's
think
probably
that's what you
policies.
talked about in your retreat. That was one of the things that came out of the action step.
I know that I believe the comment was made to me that there's some people who are very passionate about the stop signs we have in maintaining.
Really?
Oh, I'm sure.
But I think if you look at 57th Street, you probably need to look overall at the city.
Oh, I agree, 100%. That's just a great example. I agree with you 100%, Debbie, that we ought to look, and it looks as though Roland Park has done that, because I was just noticing just this weekend there's a lot of yields, and I'm like, that's interesting. So, you know, I think the good thing is most people in the area in our city probably expect a stop sign there, and when there's a yield, they'll probably still be stopping for a long time anyhow. But anyhow, it's not going to have a negative impact on our community. It might be. I'm done.
The general census though is that the more number of stop signs you have on a road, speeds actually increase because the people feel they need to speed up between the stop signs, knowing that they have to stop again. And so the average speed is actually higher.
It probably technically includes that it increases the pollution rate because people are accelerating more. And
Well, if there's no other business.
It's not 9:45 yet, guys.
Do we hear, a motion to adjourn?
I don't think we should.
Yeah.
I motion to adjourn.
Thank you all.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. And especially the young chief scout.
Only one so far. I have another 10 days, 7 days. Before I move on.
You're gonna chain your two with
I'm in the city of Mary.
Oh,
Right
really?
now,
Big chain.
It'll be a HR director. I have a previous HR director. And Allison went out to be closer to her kids.
which is good.
Yeah.
So we need to talk about that, and then we need to talk about